We really need to understand something up front here. Sometimes it takes a major crisis to clear out all the dysfunction, all the chaos, and all the deeply embedded problems that have been building up in the geopolitical and financial systems over the past 2 decades, maybe even longer. Today I'm joined once again by Simon Hunt from Simon Hunt Strategic Services. Now, many of you will know Simon as a specialist in the copper markets, but he's also someone with deep insight into geopolitics. And that makes this a very timely conversation, because right now, more than ever, there's a ton of noise in the mainstream media, and it's tough to separate the signal from all the spin. Simon, thanks for coming back. We're watching these massive shifts happen in real time. Old alliances are getting shaky, tensions are running high, and there are actual shooting wars going on right now. There's a level of global instability that we haven't really seen since, what would you say, the Cuban Missile Crisis? Maybe the height of the Vietnam War? So what's actually happening here? Where should people be focusing their attention right now? What do you see when you look past the headlines? That's a great question, and not an easy one to answer, to be honest. You really have to dig beneath the surface to find out what's going on. Because the media, they mostly just tell you what they think you want to hear. A lot of it is, quite frankly, nonsense. But our take is this, and let me try to start at the top of the pyramid, so to speak. Washington has realized something. It's come to grips with the fact that the BRICS nations, that group of countries led by Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and now growing, are becoming a real threat to the dominance of the US dollar. But not just the dollar, also America's political and economic hegemony on the world stage. So, in an effort to weaken, if not outright destroy, this rising BRICS bloc, the US is deploying a variety of tactics. One of those is targeting what they perceive as the weakest link in that alliance, Iran. The thinking goes something like this. If you can take out Iran, you deal a major blow to the strength and unity of the group, especially the very close ties between Russia, China, and Iran. When you say take out Iran, what exactly are we talking about here? Are we talking about military invasion, regime change? What does that look like in real terms? Simon, I mean it quite literally. The idea is to physically cripple Iran, destroy its infrastructure, create enough domestic chaos to trigger a regime change from the inside out. But that's the catch. Regime change only really works if it's driven internally. You can't just bomb a country into changing governments unless the people themselves are already on board. And what actually happened is this. Instead of breaking Iran apart, the attacks on Iran had the opposite effect. They brought people together. Everyone, young and old, conservative and liberal, rallied behind the supreme leader and the Iranian military. So from a strategic standpoint, that was a major miscalculation. It actually strengthened Iran's internal unity rather than weakening it. Now I want to tread carefully here, so bear with me. If you look at the origins of Israel, the founding support came from the US, the UK and France, and all of that, in many ways, was driven by one powerful family. That same family, or its network, has enormous influence over US policy, over people like Donald Trump. They shape geopolitical strategies behind the scenes. What that means is this. Everything that Israel has been doing and continues to do has the full backing of the United States. It's not rogue behavior, it's coordinated. Okay, so let's walk through this step by step. You're saying most of the US and Israeli attacks on Iran so far have done superficial damage, not actually taking out Iran's defense systems or nuclear facilities? Exactly. They've scratched the surface. But Iran's retaliatory strikes? They were different. They inflicted real damage that Israel had never experienced before. And that changed the game. Now, where are we headed? I think we're going to see another joint attack on Iran, this time from both the US and Israel, before the end of the year. That's where the momentum is building. And here's the next piece. There's a growing spotlight on Pakistan. Why? Well, because of what happened during the most recent India-Pakistan conflict. Pakistan deployed Chinese fighter jets. Their pilots were trained in China. The radar systems they used were Chinese. On the other side, India was using French-made Rafale fighter jets, along with a combination of US and Indian radar technology. And what happened? In an aerial battle, Pakistan shot down 6 Rafales from a distance of 150 kilometers. That's huge. It's massive. And now Washington is looking at Pakistan and thinking, wait a minute, this country could become a major obstacle in our goal of controlling Eurasia. So now you've got speculation, and I think it's more than just rumor, that we could see a coordinated effort from Israel and India, possibly with US support, to strike Pakistan at some point in the near future. Wow. That's not something we're hearing much about in the mainstream press. No, because it's all still in the realm of strategic conversations, what they might call contingency planning. But it's on the radar. So zooming back out to the broader Middle East, what's happening is this. Israel, with full US support, is pursuing its long-standing plan of expanding its territorial control, what's often referred to as Greater Israel. That plan involves bringing countries like Syria and Lebanon under its influence, or at least neutralizing them as threats. Just look at the recent Israeli airstrikes in Syria. Those weren't random. They were a message to the Syrian government. We're still in charge. Don't test us. So again, looking at the calendar, I believe we're going to see another major US-Israeli strike on Iran before this year is out. From Washington's point of view, that would be a win-win. It backs Israel, and it deals a potential blow to BRICS. Let me ask you this. Simon, do you think the intensity and effectiveness of Iran's response caused Washington or Tel Aviv to rethink their strategy? Because it certainly seemed like Iran caught them off guard. Without a doubt. I think they underestimated Iran's capabilities, and now they're going back to the drawing board. They're revising their strategy, and I'm fairly certain we're going to see even deeper US involvement going forward. Maybe covert, maybe overt, but it's coming. So we'll need to keep a close eye on how the US media starts to spin that story, because that'll be a sign that something's brewing. But here's the thing, you haven't mentioned Russia yet. Where does Russia fit into all this? What role are they playing in this emerging conflict? Great question. Russia, China, and Iran are in constant contact, constant coordination. They don't move unless they've consulted with one another. That's how closely aligned they are now. Each one of them understands that the US sees them as targets, and they've figured out that the only way to survive, maybe even thrive, is to stand together. If one of them is hit, the others step in. So when it comes to Iran, don't think for a moment that they're on their own. Russia and China are backing them, more than most people realize. During that last confrontation, China gave Iran a lot more support than was publicly acknowledged. So if China and Russia are actively backing Iran, then what does that tell us about the balance of power shifting in the global order? Simon, it tells us that the old world order, where America called all the shots, is breaking down. Washington knows this, and that's exactly why it's trying to destabilize these key alliances. But the more it pushes, the more it's solidifying the BRICS nations into a single cohesive front. And that leads us right into the situation in Ukraine, because that's another piece of this much bigger chessboard. Right, let's talk about Ukraine. It seems like so much of what's happening there is tied into the broader geopolitical strategy. Absolutely. The US has always viewed Ukraine as a doorway, a stepping stone into Russia, but not just in recent years. This strategy goes back decades. You can trace it all the way back to 1946, and then more aggressively since around 1995. The core policy objective from Washington has been this: dismantle Russia, split it into 4 or 5 separate regions, gain access to its vast energy reserves, gain control over its agricultural output. That's the goal. The so-called Maidan Revolution? That was part of that broader playbook. But here's where it gets critical. Vladimir Putin has been incredibly restrained up to now, especially since 2022. But he's done holding back. He now fully understands what the US strategy is and what's at stake. He's under pressure at home too, because the Russian public and military want results. They want NATO pushed back. So what we're seeing is a shift. Russia is now going on offense. No more defensive posture. So what does that look like on the ground? Are we talking about a full takeover of Ukraine? Simon, a word. Yes. Russia doesn't just want a buffer zone up to the Dnieper River. That wouldn't give Moscow enough strategic warning in the event of a missile launch or a NATO incursion. Instead, the current military push appears to have 3 main objectives. First, Russian forces are moving toward the Dnieper River and will likely push beyond it. Second, there's another column in the northeast likely targeting Kyiv. And third, a southern front will move toward Odessa, the key port city on the Black Sea. If Russia succeeds in securing those regions, then, and only then, Putin will be open to negotiations. He'll want to lock in a treaty that cements those gains. But here's the kicker. That's not going to sit well with Europe. Why not? Wouldn't peace talks be a relief? You'd think so. But the European Union, especially countries like the UK, France and Germany, actually want the war in Ukraine to continue. It's useful for them, politically, economically, even militarily. And according to some intelligence reports, those countries are preparing to send actual troops into Ukraine, boots on the ground, sometime in late summer or before year-end. That would escalate things dramatically. We're talking about direct confrontation between NATO forces and Russian troops. That's a whole new level of conflict. So the timeline is really shrinking here. We're not talking 5 years down the road. We're talking months. Exactly. And it's not just boots on the ground. Remember what Donald Trump said during his previous administration? He would load up NATO with weapons, and the EU would foot the bill. There's a good chance that logic returns if he's re-elected. Whether that includes long-range ballistic missiles, well, that's still a question. But there are reports suggesting that some already exist in Ukraine right now. Russia is actively hunting them down. In fact, we've already seen hypersonic missile strikes hitting Ukrainian military depots, destroying large stockpiles of weapons. These aren't small skirmishes anymore. This is big league warfare with strategic consequences. Okay, so we're staring down the barrel of an escalation in Ukraine, and probably in the Middle East as well, both within the next 6 months. And that brings us to the next question. What does the world look like on the other side of this? What happens if we fast forward to, say, 2030? It's a great question, and also one that's tough to answer with precision. But let's sketch it out. Whether it's 2030 or a few years beyond that, the only way we move forward is through a major global crisis, one that forces the world to reset. And that crisis, unfortunately, is likely to come in the form of a major war. It'll be a conflict between two visions of the world. On one side, you've got the push for a multipolar world, where power is distributed more evenly, and countries like China, Russia and India have more say. On the other side, you've got the remnants of the unipolar model, dominated by the United States. That clash, that's inevitable. And based on how things are moving now, I'd say that war happens around 2028. It could even come sooner. That's not a hard prediction, but it's the trajectory we're on. And when that war happens, what's the fallout, particularly from a financial perspective? This is where things get really shaky. After that crisis, we transition to a different kind of economy, one that's no longer driven by debt, but by equity. We go back to fundamentals. Global GDP growth since 1900 has averaged around 4% annually. That's where we might return to, but only after the crisis, only after the reset. Right now we're living in a financial fantasy world. Just look at the US. It used to take less than $1 of credit to generate $1 of GDP growth. In recent years, it takes over $3.50 of credit to get that same dollar of GDP. That's wild. Totally unsustainable. And that's why I keep saying we need a reset. We need a storm to clear the decks. So for those watching this and asking, what should I be doing to protect myself financially? What's your advice? My number one piece of advice? Don't think long term. Not right now. Don't commit to 10-year investment horizons or buy and hold strategies. What we're dealing with are short, violent economic cycles, up and down. These cycles might last anywhere from 12 to 24 months. That's it. So you've got to be nimble. You've got to be watching closely. Timing is everything. And what's your outlook for the near term? Let's say the next 12 to 18 months. Our base case has been that the world edges into a recession by the end of this year. And what happens, central banks and governments will throw everything they have at the problem. Stimulus, monetary easing, emergency measures. That will probably buy us a little more time. Maybe one last round of kicking the can down the road. Then, by the middle of next year, we move into stagflation. Think of it as weak growth, maybe around 2%, but with inflation holding at around 4%. And then by 2027, that's when it gets critical. That's when inflation could explode into double digits, not just in the US, but globally. That in turn would send long-term bond yields like the 10-year US Treasury into double-digit territory too. And if that happens, the entire debt-based financial system could unravel. So you're saying that interest rates themselves could become the trigger? Absolutely. And that brings us to something I'm personally wrestling with right now. Do the people who control the global financial system still have the power to manage this? And I suspect the answer might be no. It looks like Russia and China are playing a very deliberate game here. They're not just trying to protect themselves, they're trying to shape the future. They want a global economy that doesn't revolve around the US and its allies. So whatever the central banks try to do, whether it's rate cuts or stimulus, it may not matter, because events might overtake policy. And if that happens, we're looking at something closer to depression than recession. So if events spiral beyond the control of central banks, we're not just talking about turbulence, we're talking about losing control of the aircraft entirely. Exactly. And one thing that stood out to me recently was a report from the Boston Federal Reserve. They're raising the alarm internally. What they're saying is that the US banking system has become overly entangled with the private credit markets. Too much exposure, too much risk. Now, in a booming economy, that kind of setup might work. But if there's even a mild downturn, the ripple effects could be massive. The Boston Fed is basically warning that a recession could trigger a full-on systemic crisis. And they're not wrong. And that's just the US side of things. We haven't even factored in the European or Japanese financial systems yet. Right. Those systems are fragile too, maybe even more so in some areas. Which brings us to this other layer of uncertainty, this weird tug-of-war that's happening between Jerome Powell and Donald Trump. Ah, yes, the drama at the Fed. Yeah, Trump's been very vocal. He's already talking about firing Powell if he gets back into office. There are even reports that he drafted a letter to remove him. Now, that letter was never sent, mainly because members of Congress and the Senate talked him down, but still, just the fact that it got that far, that tells you everything. But can a sitting president actually fire the Fed chair? Legally? No, not easily. The chairman of the Federal Reserve has protections in place for exactly this reason. It's supposed to be independent from politics. But Trump doesn't necessarily play by the normal rulebook. If he can't fire Powell, then maybe he just makes the job unbearable, pressure him into stepping down voluntarily. That seems to be part of the strategy. But here's the real takeaway. The mere fact that Trump is even considering this kind of move speaks volumes about his concerns. It means even he sees that the system is teetering. That's the message underneath all the political noise. And the irony, of course, is that the Fed only really controls short-term rates, right? It can't do much about long-term interest rates. That's the problem. The Fed can nudge the short end of the curve, but they can't dictate where 10-year or 30-year bond yields go. That's where the so-called bond vigilantes come in, investors who force reality back into the system. And those folks, they're not going to give up without a fight. So if you're asking, where's the canary in the coal mine? It's long-term rates. That's what you watch. That's your early warning system. Where are we right now in terms of long-term rates? At the moment, we're sitting at around 4.5% on the 10-year Treasury. Our view is that we could see a bit more of an uptick, maybe to 5% or just above, before we get a temporary pullback. By the middle of next year, we think rates could drop to around 3%. That'll be the calm before the storm. Because after that, they start rising again. And we believe they'll keep climbing until they hit double digits, likely in the second half of 2027 or early 2028. Double-digit yields on 10-year treasuries? That's unheard of in the modern era. It is. But that's what happens when inflation gets out of control and you've got a massively indebted system. When rates go that high, you basically break the machine. The math just doesn't work anymore. That's why this next period is going to be so volatile. The rules are changing. You can't think in terms of the last 10 years. You have to think in terms of survival and adaptability. So in that environment, long-term investing is off the table? Correct. You've got to play the cycle. In and out. Fast. These swings are going to be brutal. One year you're up, the next year you're down. So don't lock yourself into anything. Stay agile. And that brings us to real assets. Physical protection. We touched on gold earlier. What else should people be thinking about in terms of holding or owning? Gold is essential. Physical gold, not ETFs, not certificates, the real thing. Because at the end of the day, it's a store of value that exists outside of the system. But beyond gold, food. I cannot stress this enough. Food is going to become one of the most critical resources. You're saying food inflation is going to soar? Absolutely, and for multiple reasons. First, the conflict with Russia is already having a huge impact. Russia's a major supplier of wheat, fertilizer, and other agricultural commodities. Disrupt that flow, and prices spike globally. Second, we're heading into a phase of increasingly erratic weather. There's a 90-year agricultural cycle, the Gleisberg cycle, and it's starting to kick in again. The last time it peaked, we saw the Dust Bowl in the American Midwest. That same region, the heart of US food production, could be facing similar challenges starting as early as next year. Droughts, crop failures, unpredictable harvests. So your advice? Stock up. Seriously. If you've got deep freezers, fill them. If you have any outdoor space, turn it into a garden. Grow your own vegetables. Become as self-sufficient as possible. This isn't fear-mongering. It's just practical. When things get tight, supply chains break down and prices skyrocket, you'll be glad you prepared. Makes a lot of sense. Especially if food shortages start becoming a regular part of the global news cycle. They will. And remember, it's not just about war. It's about systems that are already stretched to the limit. Financial systems, agricultural systems, energy systems. We're entering a period where resilience is the most valuable currency you can have. That means assets you can hold, skills you can use, community you can rely on. That's a powerful note to end on. Simon, thank you so much for this deep dive. It's sobering stuff, but it's also incredibly valuable. People need to hear it. Thank you for having me. These conversations matter, and I'm always glad to be part of them. Likewise, we'll continue to track these developments, and as always, we'll do our best to bring clarity to the chaos. Thanks to all of you watching. Stay informed, stay aware, and most importantly, stay prepared.